So it's my pleasure then to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Bill McIlroy, who's the chair and professor in Department of Kinesiology at the University of Waterloo. And Dr. McIlroy co-leads the ONDRI's Gait and Balance platform, as well as AIM2 and the remote monitoring platform. And I guess the final link I would make from my talk, where I showed you these molecular biomarkers attacking neural circuits that ultimately affect behavior, Dr. McIlroy is going to expand on that and show how these different circuits are affecting behaviors that he can now measure with wearables, et cetera. So thanks for joining us, Dr. McIlroy.
Thank you very much, Doug. Appreciate the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just need some sort of confirmation that you can see everything okay. Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak this morning. I hope, I know I've been given 2 sections here, and I'm doing this on behalf of a number of other people, and I'll try to break this in the right spot. But Ruth, if you think I should pause for a break, you can just tell me and I'll pause, and then we can pick up. I've got a break in here, but it might be too later. So I first wanted to start by acknowledging that what I'm about to tell you about is really the product of a lot of people, and some of the key people to the content I'm going to present are Dr. Karen Van Utegem, Angela Roberts, and Kit Beyer, as well as doctoral students Beth Godkin, Ben Cornish, and some of our key staff, Kyle Weber and Vanessa Tai. All of the folks here, along with the Hands Ontario team and steering committee and all our cooperative students, have been the people that have really made this all work, and all the slides are largely the product of them, and I just have the privilege of being able to present all of the good work that they've done. I wanted to just give you a bit of a framework for what we're going to sort of cover, to give you a little bit of background, why we're trying to measure things basically at home remotely, what and how we should do this, at least from our perspective, what do you have to do to get it right, what we learned today, a little bit about what's in Hands Ontario, and I know Dr. Schwartz talks about this a bit more, but I'll talk a little bit about the feedback forums related to Hands Ontario, and then a little bit about what is coming. So let's just start with the background. Not so long ago, ONDRI directed some of its attention to this sort of at-home approach, the idea of acquiring and collecting data at home. And the idea was to sort of exploit and take advantage of the emerging technologies that made this possible. Over the last many years, the miniaturization, the smaller batteries, the ability to store and stream data have made it increasingly possible to acquire high quality information from people out of the clinic and at home. And to enable this, to make sure that people with neurodegenerative disease and their care providers and clinicians were part of the target for all of this, we decided as part of ONDRI, important for us to take some leadership in this space. And certainly we're interested in the role that these remote technologies and monitoring could provide in diagnosis, prognosis, care, and outcomes. And to Doug's point in the talk before, the idea of trying to find basically biomarkers captured in this particular way on sensors, wearable sensors, is to complement all the other measures that are being captured to inform us about next best steps. So I give you this little bit of a framework only to identify where we're going to focus our attention. What constitutes ONDRI at Home is a much bigger enterprise. There are many moving parts to ensuring that we can collect data remotely. I'm going to talk obviously about the wearable sensors, but for example, there's a significant and important role for intermittent assessing, like cognitive testing. And of course, the Doug's example of eye tracking as a potential target for intermittent assessment done at home, and biosamples. All of those are critical to and eventually an ideally successful at-home approach here. In addition, the idea that there needs to be a very user-friendly interface and mechanism by which individuals can share their information out of home, those are also things we target and that are important. And of course, all the related parts, the neuroinformatics, the integration of input from clinicians and research, all of that is part of the bigger picture. But I'm going to focus today on this little window on the left on wearable sensors. And in this space, our goals are trying to take an advantage of what's out there already, the existing technologies and the existing analytics, and try to find the best of those or the combination of those, help remove barriers to use to make them far more usable and useful. And part of this is about how we look at this information. The sensors, I'll talk in a little bit in a minute about what the sensor technology really is about, but it's pretty straightforward. The challenge in all this is what you do with that data. How do you turn it into something useful? And so that's all about the data analytics. So we're trying to make the most of this information by how we sort of analyze it. And maybe the most important thing to do is, what do you do with this data once you get it? How do you communicate this information to the people that are going to use it in a way that's meaningful, whether it be the individuals themselves with lived experience, care providers, or clinicians? We have to convert this data into something that can be acted on. Otherwise, it's just a giant data collection exercise, which might not be terribly useful. So I share this with you a little bit, not for you to read all the words in it, but it sort of captures the scope in the wearable space of all the things you have to worry about. So certainly down here at the end, you need to capture the data at home in some way. And this often involves hardware, sensors, and all important matters of usability and feasibility. Can you capture this data successfully in a way that is not intrusive, that is effective, and that is valid? And then you need to convert that data into something meaningful, some outcome measure that is useful, that is reproducible, that has meaning to clinicians and to users. So this is all about the analytics and what you do with that data and how you move it around. But the part that probably gets a lot less attention is then, what do you do with that data? Presenting that data back to people so they can use it. This for us is a really key target in our ONDRI at Home initiative. And then where we are headed in the future, of course, is how to ensure that it's being used, educated, whole issues around policy and practice, implementing technology as usual care. All of this has to be part of the bigger picture as we move forward and seeing wearable technology and at-home technologies more generally be incorporated into the healthcare system. So this is something you'll see in this presentation that represents one of the major distinctions of what's happening in the ONDRI at home approach. Critical to that last part, I would say that critical to the presentation and using is you have to understand who's going to use it and what they need. And so a significant part of the activities we've been involved in is engaging and listening. This is so critical to this exercise. So early on when we started this, we talked to the stakeholders about what they need. And there's this one quote that was quite striking and speaks to our motivation in this space. And I'll just read it to you because it still, it just holds up and is really relevant when you're thinking about capturing information at home and why it might be important. Living as a caregiver 24/7, each small change in your loved ones become the new normal. And you can easily miss the more day-to-day changes as you're looking for the big changes that you can report to the neurologist at your scheduled appointment once every 6 months. And this speaks a little bit to the opportunities that are afforded collecting data more continuously, more sensibly to detect changes and track things that is one of the reasons we think an at-home approach might be particularly useful. Of course, people had lots of particular areas they thought would be important and interesting to them. And we certainly tracked those and tried to marry our approach to the needs of the people that we're serving in this space. So why measure at home? As I mentioned, there is a demonstrated link between health and measures we can capture at home. And I'll give you just a couple of examples, and there's many more. One very strong example, and this is work that we get great guidance and leadership from Dr. Andrew Lim, and that is the relationship between sleep and risk of and progression of a neurodegenerative disease characteristics, particularly those related to dementia. Sleep is an interesting and important behavior that is obviously much more difficult to capture clinically. It can be done, but if one is able to do it successfully at home, it certainly makes it far more practical. Mobility is another one that has gotten lots of attention about gait quality and movement emerge as an early preclinical feature of cognitive decline. And this is another area of interest in some of the measures we capture about what mobility looks like and the patterns and the characteristics. Another one that's emerged very strong over the last 10 to 15 years is how critical physical activity is in reducing or influencing risk of dementia. And then one area that Dr. Andrew Roberts helps lead us is in the whole idea of social connectedness and how it's connected to exceptional cognitive aging. In this particular case, the important issues such as speech and language as markers of social connectedness are an area that we have a strong focus on. And the other reason to be at home is some of the measures we're interested in are very difficult to capture in a clinical setting. I mentioned sleep already, cardiovascular function, dysautonomia, activity and mobility, and socialization, and agitation, anxiety, stress. All of these characteristics or features or physiological responses to situations are hard either to simulate in the clinical setting or may not be captured in the short time someone is in the clinic. So being able to capture these things at home is certainly a significant advantage as we sort of uncover the relationship between the disease, the progression, and even links to treatments. So measuring home can provide a few things for us. It can provide a more rapid response to action if we're capturing data more sensitively and more often. It has the potential to reveal causes of things that are infrequent or time varying changes. So things that change over time within a day or they're relatively infrequent, we can capture the data that might reveal the cause of those. There's evidence that is a more sensitive measure to evaluate some treatments because you're evaluating that data on almost a moment-to-moment basis related on the timing, for example, to a particular treatment. A good example of this is the work we're doing as part of an impact study in the relationship between Parkinson's medications and characteristics in day-to-day life. And another really important one is the opportunity that wearable devices and remote measurement can help serve those who are underserved by clinical services, those who have reduced access, either because of geography or other challenges. A remote measurement technology has an opportunity to help them. So what and how do we measure things remotely? What are the approaches we can use? Well, the new technology, as I mentioned, has made many things possible. And there are devices for a number of things that can capture physiologic responses, movement. There's all sorts of devices around wearable locations that can capture motion, cardiac function, muscle function, skin conductance. There are other devices around measuring body motion. All sorts of things exist now that allow measurement at home possible. And they're small, they capture the data over extended periods of time. And this has accelerated over the last 5 years. If one tracks the number of papers in the literature related to wearables, it is logarithmic. It is just climbing so quickly. And it makes it a wonderful opportunity, but it also makes it quite complicated about deciphering what is working and what is not. The ones you'll may be most familiar with, or most people familiar with, are the consumer-ready ones, the Fitbits and the Apple Watches, and they've had a lot of attention. And a lot of those devices are being used, at least for health applications. They certainly are a convenient wear location, worn on the wrist. They do provide some summary health measures, although at times we worry a little bit after we've sort of validated them about the quality of that signal. And it can tell you a little bit about what you did compared to your health status. So they're interesting tools. What they are is a demonstration of the possibility. That's what I think they really are. They are really quite cool demonstrations of the possibility of sensors worn on the wrist to acquire data continuously. But as a tool to inform us as we focus on neurodegeneration, either risk of or progression, they really are very limited. And I'll share that with you why in a moment. There are a number of what we call research-ready wearable devices, not as appealing in terms of maybe what they look like, but are capturing the data in ways that are important and unique from those commercial devices. In other words, the data is available to us. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they all have the same feature. they all contain the same sort of sensors, which makes them all possible to collect the same type of data. So we're going to talk just about a couple that are common to the devices, all of these devices, and a focus of the devices that we extract behavioral data from. Accelerometers and gyroscopes are what are classically called inertial measurement devices. They're based on inertial properties or motion properties to capture the motion of a device. An accelerometer measures linear motion and linear acceleration specifically, and a gyroscope measures rotational velocity. And so if you place them on the limb, you can measure movement. And if you place them on certain limbs in certain places, you can get quite specific about the nature of that movement. There's also optical sensors. Optical sensors are the ones you will see easily see in a Fitbit, for example, or an Apple Watch with the lights that are on the bottom. Those optical sensors emit light and then have a collection device on the other side to measure the changes in tissue properties or fluid motion. So they'll often be used for pulse pressure in PPG systems or oximetry for oxygen levels. So optical sensors are quite common. Bioelectric sensors, we focus on a bioelectric sensor as one of our sensors to measure cardiac function, ECG. These are just devices that record the difference between electrical potential. So you could have a bioelectric sensor for muscle activity, for galvanic skin response, arousal, that sort of stuff too as well. But what's fundamental about all these is there's just sort of, there's foundational sensor types. And you will find these in almost, in many, many different devices. The watches, for example, the Fitbit watches have accelerometers, gyroscope, optical sensors, thermometers. The Apple Watch, the new one has a bioelectric sensor. When you touch the crown, it closes the bioelectric loop and you can measure some cardiac function. So all of these you'll find in conventional and research grade tools. And I thought I'd take the liberty just to give you a bit of a sense of what are involved in these. So this is just demonstrates you. This is a Gene Active watch, one of the original ones we used. It's a research grade device, has a 3-dimensional accelerometer in it. I'm just going to run a little video. And this video is showing you when you rotate the position, the acceleration changes due to gravity. And you'll see these shift in its position. So these slow frequency are just showing the different tilt positions as gravity pulls on the different 3-dimensional sensor. And if you do it something more dynamically, depending on the direction you do it, you'll see the motion in this device. And that's all an accelerometer does. It conveys the information about the linear acceleration of a device and its orientation. Now, what's really critical is where you place this device. It gives you either a really good ability to detect a specific behavior or it's more difficult. So this particular video captured on behalf of by Ben Cornish for us just shows you this. He's gone out and captured some data on a walk. And I'm going to pause this just for a second. So he has one on his wrist and he has one on his ankle, and these are synchronized. So they're happening at the very same time. And you'll see here on the ankle, a really clear pattern. No surprise here. That really high impact that you can see here in the red here it is in the blue and red. That really high impact is the foot hitting the ground. When you hit the ground, there's a high degree of acceleration, a shock wave actually that runs up your shank and body. It's a kinetic characteristic of walking and very distinguishable. And as your heel comes off the ground, you go through a swing phase and you can see the linear acceleration of the swing phase. So you see this very reproducible pattern, one limb after another alternating. If you're going to measure walking and characterize the features of walking, either looking for step-to-step variability as a variability index of dynamic stability control, which we know to be an important indicator of central nervous system status and linked to neurodegenerative disease, or if you're interested, for example, in how much people walk or the volume or the characteristics, the ankle is a place to be, or at least on the leg. At the arm, you will see a rhythm. You'll see an oscillation in here that occurs as the arm swings. And if you do some analytics, you can find the cycle of walking in here, but it's not nearly as strong a signal. And it's much more difficult to be reliably detecting. And what if you're holding on to something? Of course, then it becomes not very useful at all. So while an accelerometer can be a very powerful tool, where you wear it and how you analyze it ultimately define its usability. And this one, Beth Godkin grabbed us a bit of data for us. This just emphasizes the point even more. This is just terstationary cycling, and it just emphasizes the importance of wear location. Of course, there's no surprise the arms are not moving here, but she's very active and you can see the rhythm. And you'll also notice the pattern is different here. We can distinguish obviously cycling from walking here because the pattern is so very different. So how you use these devices and where they're worn is pretty critical. And I'm going to walk through here and just show you a couple of examples of how you could just take the principle of accelerometry and reveal behavior. And this is all based on where you put the device and how you analyze it. It's the same sensor, the very same sensor is being used here to extract very different things. So as I said before, mobility has, walking has this very stereotypical kinematic and kinetic characteristic, and you can see this pattern on a leg worn very simply. It's the same sort of idea I showed you on the last slide, where you see this very consistent and regular pattern, a stance phase, a swing phase, and impact, and this continues and iterates as you walk. And this data here is, this is a little bit hard to follow, and I just meant to be something we go through quite quickly, but this is 7 days worth of data from an accelerometer. This happens to be a gyroscope, but the same related principle, I suppose. But this is 7 days worth of data. I highlight this too because I want to zoom in. Right here, you can't see much, you can't distinguish much, but what you can see is circadian. There's a sleep. There's a wake, there's a sleep period. You can see that pattern, but you can't see much else. If I zoom in a little bit, I've zoomed in here to probably about 12 hours or more. Here more easily, you can see the sleep period here, and then they've gotten out of bed here. They start to move a little bit. Again, you can see the patterns at a macro level. It gets increasingly interesting about what you can pull out. If I zoom in a little bit more, you start to see bouts of activity that are a little bit more specific, sort of high intensity bouts here, and there's one here I'm going to zoom into in a minute as you start to zoom into this data a little bit more. And then I zoomed into this period even more, and I've done this for a very particular reason. If I go back, this is the period I'm looking at, this bout right here in time. It's not a very long bout, but it's very specifically walking. This is a bout of walking. You can see the gait initiation starts right here. There's a gait termination phase. This is a relatively long bout in terms of number of steps, but what's underneath this is a very specific pattern. Identifiable and distinguishable, extract the gait information. We know it's walking. And I know that's walking because of the wear location and also the signal characteristics, how we analyze the data. We can also use accelerometry to estimate the intensity of activity. Kyle Weaver's been doing a lot of this work for us, looking at how you use accelerometry off the leg of the arm to characterize how intense the activity is. So I can then take, here's some data on this side here, again, 7 days worth of data. You can see the circadian cycle, wake, sleep cycle, all the way through this for the 5 to 7 days. And then what's interesting is the intensity of this activity is a measure of how active somebody is. And that's a body of work that's been going on for us for a bit of time because we know the relationship between physical activity and neurodegeneration. And there's a number of approaches you can use to estimate activity, again, from the same sensor. You can use the same sensor accelerometry. Thank you, Dr. Andrew Lim, for these slides, in the same way to estimate sleep quality. And we do this in our studies to use accelerometry data, estimate things like sleep duration, sleep fragmentation, as well as I mentioned before, the diurnal rhythmicity or characteristics of sleep. And you can do other measures to augment sleep, but accelerometry worn, in this particular case, most commonly used on the wrist to estimate activity, is considered a very important and reliable index of sleep quality. You can interestingly also use accelerometry to measure speech, and Dr. Angela Roberts, who's a key part of our ONDRI team, leads this very innovative body of work with her colleagues at Northwestern University. And in this particular case, the sensor here shown on the left as an example of this is worn just around the sternal notch, just below the vocal cords. And when you speak, those vocal cords vibrate. when they vibrate, they cause motion of that sensor. Remember that sensor in there is an accelerometer. It detects any kind of motion. It's just now really, really small motion. And you can see vibrations and mechanical acoustic vibrations. So accelerometry can be used to measure speech. And Dr. Roberts has a remarkable toolkit that helps extract out features of that talking with regard to the complexity of speaking that gets us back to social connectedness, cognitive biomarkers. You can also extend this accelerometry then to swallowing. And some ventilation information as well in terms of breathing. And these are all important things as we look into other characters such in ALS, where swallowing, for example, is a very important marker of the progression of the disease. So accelerometry, again, properly worn, analyzed, can yield a lot of meaningful information. And more recently, we've been looking at using this to the same devices, using it to assess posture, lying, sitting, standing. And the reason for doing this is the important link between sedentary behavior, trying to minimize sedentary behavior and the impact it has on brain health. And so you can use these devices, particularly if you combine them. A trunk and a shin, for example, combined together gives us a high probability of predicting. Kyle Weber's been working on these analytics for us, but this is a really good example both of the value of accelerometry and merging sensors, or something called sensor fusion. Mentioned this one. Now we drift a little bit from the accelerometry, where I hope you get a sense that there's a lot that's possible about markers. And I haven't mentioned the other utility of the IMUs. I was going to do that at the end, but I should make sure that it's clear that we don't just use them for walking. We use them for tremor detection and bradykinesia. We look for other characteristics or symptoms that are movement related. This is what the IMUs can afford us. The bioelectric devices we've been using have been principally around measuring cardiac function. And of course, ECG is the electrical activity of the heart. In this particular case, it's really just a sensor that's chest worn, either vertical or horizontal, and you can generate this very classic ECG profile. And an example of some of this data that we've been using is the raw ECG signal, and you can extract heart rate, for example, from these. The red dots automatically detected the heart rate from the ventricular contraction that's occurring. And then you can map that heart rate over a 24-hour period. So here's the changes in heart rate over 24 hours. And you can look at it and look how variable the heart rate is. You can look for changes in heart rate that are meaningful. But the interesting part of this is if you don't have context about what's going on, it's somewhat difficult to interpret the changes in these heart rates. So context is absolutely critical. And how do you get context? You get context by combining other sensors and other behavioral markers. So at the very end here is an example, and I'll show you another slide in a minute. It's just a bout of walking, where you can see the elevation in the heart rate here that's occurred at this period here was temporally coincident with the period of walking. So when they began to walk, their heart rate elevated. And this is really important for us as we start to look for how heart rate and gives us an index of things that are happening. So anxiety or stress that is an increase in heart rate that would be dissociated from a movement requirement is something we will look for. An example here of the context is the gray represents on the graph. This is a much shorter window. It looks like it's about an hour's worth of data. Kyle passed me these slides the other day. So as he's processing some of this data, so there is heart rate over time. This is just the heart rate changing over time. And all the gray bars are periods of walking that are overlaid on top of it. And you can see the relationship at times of the clear relationship in this bout, for example, where the heart rate response immediately responds in a very workload dependent and then drops at the end of the workload. You can see other times where that relationship is not as clear, but there's this important coupling between heart rate, movement, and then non-movement. This is a good example of one on the bottom to say, what is the context here? The bottom graph here is a heart rate that's continuous collected over a much shorter period. We've got a few minutes worth of data here. And then there's this large steep rise in the heart rate right there. And one could be somewhat stumped about this is if you don't have other information. Well, this is actually pretty simple. This is someone waking up in the morning and getting out of bed. And the reason this is such an important example to show you is we're particularly interested in dysautonomia, the idea of regulating blood flow, particularly as it potentially relates to falls, but certain autonomic function in its relationship between movement and the regulation of blood pressure is sort of critical. And we can see these trends in. So if we overlaid posture here, you would see the postural transition and the heart rate response during that. So this is just to reinforce the idea that having a sensor is one thing and having lots of data, but without context and without interpretability, you can be left just with lots of interesting data.
Can you briefly speak to the bioethical implications of at-home monitoring?
No one can speak briefly on this topic. That would be extremely difficult because it is complicated. But I can tell you that remains one of our most important sort of guiding principles. And one of the things we've been always advocating for is this idea that what we're really doing is trying to collect data that empowers the users. So the data is, theirs to use, and then we share it appropriately with relevant clinicians. The monitoring of people continuously is always a challenge. I did want to speak just quickly to the whole issue of the attention that's paid to this issue around ethics and all the issues around of that. A good example of one that came up, and this is probably more about privacy, is this whole issue of speech detection and the idea of audio recording and all the implications that would lead to. And of course, Andrew Roberts, involved with the group on speech, this is sort of gets resolved in this very unique way she's approached it, in which it's a mechanoacoustic sensor. In other words, no sound is collected at all. And so at the forefront of all of our concerns, always as we proceed through this, are the ethics, are the privacy of the data, of where it goes and who holds it. And I haven't done justice to that excellent question, but I can certainly offline chat more. Thanks. So I in the limited time that I have, I'm going to expedite, I'll flip over some slides, and I wanted to address a few things. First of all, the approach that we're adopting in ONDRI is to try to get this right. And there's a few principles that we've sort of focused on. First of all is the importance of the data to the needs of the users and the care providers. This for us is absolutely critical. If the information is not useful to the users, care providers, and clinicians, then it's not really going to be helpful to make a difference. And the other thing is it really has to be usable, personalized, and of course it has to be validated. All of these are absolutely critical, and the usable has to be really usable. It's one day say someone can use it. It's another thing to say they can use it for 7 days, 10 days, not encumbering them. And there's really two different levels of usability. We've really focused our attention on making things innocuous, not difficult to use, and therefore we've got devices, for example, which people just basically put on and ignore as to an attempt to achieve that. And that's something that's absolutely essential to the success of this, and it does relate to one of the observations we've noted already about the effectiveness of this. As I mentioned, we've identified interest in stakeholders, and so it always came back when we started, why not just use a Fitbit or an Apple Watch? Well, the measures that we're interested in are not available off of a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. The measures that are related to particular diseases or symptoms, you're just not going to get them off an Apple or Fitbit. You can't tailor the experience for the user. And bigger concern is you can't advance the science because you often can't get the data. Now, Apple does have an opportunity for people to collaborate with them, and you can, but often the data is hidden and often the data is proprietary. And the other thing is, putting a device just on the wrist, I hope gathering from what I said before, is pretty limiting. The activities and behaviors we can capture off the wrist is not actually an ideal location for many of the things we want to capture. So the single sensor off the wrist, not ideal. And actually more generally, a single sensor is not ideal. And so then the question becomes is what sensors and where do you use them? So we have a multi-sensor approach, which is somewhat unique to our work. This multi-sensor approach, we still look to minimize the number, but maximize the benefit. For example, in the Hands Ontario, we have 3, one on the ankle, one on the wrist, and one on the chest, providing complementary information and provide us the various measures that we need. Without those 3, it would be very difficult to reconstruct meaningful behavioral measures that would inform us. this is what's possible when you have multiple sensors. You can get all sorts of measures from single sensors, and then you can combine these sensors for other things. And we really view this as an essential step forward in the use of wearable technology. It just can't be a wristwatch. What have we learned then? Because I've just sort of quickly through there made the point that it really have to have a multi-sensor approach, and you have to tailor it and personalize it as we learn more and more. But we have been doing this for a little bit now. We've had 3 studies, an early pilot study in individuals who are average age was 90. They wore 4 sensors 24/7, multimodal and multinodal. Then we had our feasibility study in people with lived experience with neurodegenerative disease, wearing as many as 6 sensors for 7 days. And then we've been doing a feasibility and usability in a PD and dance study where we're looking to track not only daily life, but also the intervention. And all of these studies, a key component was feasibility and usability. Were people willing to do this? And part of it was about how we could develop an approach that would permit it without people getting frustrated in too many devices. We've landed on Hands Ontario on 3 because we've been able to minimize some of the need for all of those sensors, because in these early days, we're trying to learn lessons. One of the important messages here of these various sensors we use, ankle, wrist, and chest are the ones, is that people are willing and able to do this. These are our non-wear periods. We use non-wear as periods when people took it off as an indicator of tolerance and feasibility. And a recent paper that Beth Godkin has led with Karen Van Ootken is about the feasibility of multiple sensor wear in people with neurodegenerative disease. And it was highly accepted. Down here, you can see a couple of people down here who have higher non-wear periods, but the majority of people are really just taking them off for a shower or a bath, and for 7 days, 24 hours a day, willing, and at the end of the study saying, yeah, it was not a problem. And part of the reason is because they don't have to do anything with them. They put them on and take it off. The key factors, however, were comfort, ease of use, can't interfere with my activities of daily living, and an important matter of aesthetic, which we still haven't mastered quite as well. But these are all key criteria to ensuring people are willing and able to use them. Now you have to remember, they're not interacting with these devices in a meaningful way. They're really placing them on, and all the back end is getting done without them having to worry about it. The other part that we learned about and we developed is feedback. This is back to the idea of getting information. So in the Remind study, we developed our first feedback form, the form that goes back to users to give them information. And we did a lot of work on the front end about what this information was and how we should do it out of the Remind study. And it has led us to develop in the Hands Ontario a very elegant starting point for our V1 version of the feedback form, which I'll show you in a minute. The other thing that we've been able to do is reinforce the idea of personalization. This is 6 randomly selected people out of Hands Ontario, literally yesterday, randomly selected without regard to who they were. And this is, it's a bit hard to see here, but these are different days for each person. So this is 2, 4, 6, 7 days. And the pattern up here is the daily pattern of walking, 7 days for one person, then a second person, a third, fourth, and fifth. And the thing that will strike you is the variability between people and between days. One cannot imagine a single solution and an absence of personalization to be a win here. We have to be able to personalize, we have to be able to give back information that is unique to them, and we have to look at solutions that address the heterogeneity of behaviors and characteristics. So I'm not going into the deep dive into Hands Ontario, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. I want to highlight the Hands iceberg, I have now been calling it. And the iceberg, of course, you see lots above the water, you don't see anything that's in behind it. And so what is collected in Hands Ontario is the things I mentioned before: an ankle worn IMU, that's the inertial sensors, or wrist worn, a chest for an IMU and ECG, they wear 7 days, innocuous. We're eventually incorporating speech. That's not done in our currently Hands Ontario. It's been done in some of our impact studies, but those are all collected sort of continuously. Blood samples, clinical work, health comes and service. See all that on the end. And what happens at the beginning is We do an analytic pipeline that gets us to gait, sleep, mobility, and sedentary behavior, and we generate this wonderful feedback form. And it gets a lot of attention because I think it's extremely valuable as a starting point. The thing that someone has to always understand in all of this is that is the tip of the iceberg of what HANDS gets us and what HANDS has the opportunity to do. That's my attempt at a boat, by the way, that thing in the middle there. I know it's a little weak, but that was my drawing attempt with my mouse. So what's under all of this iceberg is so much more that we're continuing to advance what the HANDS Ontario experience is doing. So all of these other measures, either in development or part of the clinical report, which is under development, cardiovascular, anxiety, arousal, speech, falls, posture, so on and so forth, biomarkers, genetics, cognition, clinical outcomes. What's underneath this of all of the stuff about advancing the clinical report and advancing knowledge, all the things that Doug and Mario were talking about is all part of HANDS Ontario as well. So the wearable sensors and the feedback form get a lot of attention and they're visible and very important. But I think it's critical to understand what's really under this is all of the bottom of that iceberg. I'm going to skip that. I just want to talk briefly about this feedback form because it is one of the key things that we've been developing as a way to share the data. The feedback report that's provided as part of HANDS Ontario is an augmented one developed out of the REMIND study. It has some very nice information for people just as a resource in terms of readability. It's been laid out in a way that provides both tabular data, which is high-level tabular data information with regard to guidelines that are in the literature. It does daily summaries. It provides day-to-day variation in terms of patterns. The modularity of it and the readability of it have been augmented through feedback with our PCAC and others to try to get this right so it is usable. Some sample images from an example of the feedback, which is delivered both electronically and in paper as required, is looks something like this for walking. So we do get that step count thing. Your Fitbit would do that too. But again, it's not all we get from this, and it's not all we display. That daily summary that's out here, which has your step counts, has the daily patterns, and then long bouts and extra long bouts, because a lot of the steps will be activities of daily living. Our interest is in augmenting that with some purposeful walking to improve activity. And then you can see the patterns, how they were distributed over the day. This is important to us because we're looking for relationships in day-to-day variation and when people do and do not engage in activities. And then once we've got this, what's the characteristic of that walking within that day? It's something we can do with the sensors that we have. Same thing for sleep, looking for sleep fragmentation in these patterns. When you get up at night, all of those things are possible, and we deliver back on these feedback forms, and daily activity patterns and sedentary behavior in the same way. These are all serving as our first formal return for information that's done as part of the HANDS Ontario study, which is followed up, interestingly enough, by what we call our V5 visit. The V5 visit is our attempt to get feedback on the feedback so we can continue to improve that part of what we're working on. And so 2 weeks after receiving the feedback, individuals have a V5, and Dr. Angela Roberts and Karen Van Uttingen put together these slides for me, which is just a quick highlight of some recent, the first 14 people, I believe, that we've had a chance to do this. So 92% of the people found this information to be beneficial to varying degrees, 52% very helpful, 21% helpful, and 50% somewhat helpful. But 92% are finding some value in this. And I think I spoke to Karen this morning about this, and there really is an appetite to get information back in a timely way. So these are coming back to people in a 2 to 3 week window. They're not waiting for 6 months when the study's done. These are done because we've automated the pipelines, and they're coming back quickly to people to talk about what their data looks like. 38% of the people made a change to lifestyle within the last 2 weeks, in part because of the information they gathered from this. They were increasingly aware of good sleep and monitoring sedentary behavior. 92% shared the information with a family or friend. Critical, I think, in this whole exercise of it, sharing health information with others, having the conversation and talking. The motivation to share was related to making lifestyle changes and educating, advocate change in others. They were also using their information to encourage others to attend to these important matters too as well. So a variety of reasons. Saw your hand, Ruth, thanks, almost there. And then of course, the motivation for sharing with family and friends is around self-advocacy, trying to help partners understand their symptoms, helping other family members understand their symptoms. And again, remembering that the clinical reporting is all part of what's to come. This is just a sort of the start of where we've begun. So I wanted to get just really briefly in 1 or 2 slides. It just takes just a couple seconds here to wrap up what's on the horizon for us. Certainly the clinical report is a real target for us, is now getting those disease-specific characteristics as part of our standard reporting and refining those analyses, which are ongoing right now for tremor and restless leg syndrome, freezing of gait and bradykinesia, dysphagia, dysautonomia, agitation, and cardiovascular events. All of those are the target of our analytics. Refining those that exist in the literature or developing our own. And we still remain importantly focused on technology that's emerging, because we're not doing this in a bubble. People are developing technologies and we're looking for ways to integrate these and at-home assessments that allow us to do intermittent testing, such as the kinds of things Doug mentioned, and cognitive testing done in other ways. All of that is part of this bigger package and the target of what we're headed to. Hope to much more from a small number of small sensors to achieve a lot, maximize the benefit of very little challenge and effort on the user side. Anyway, I'll pause there, Ruth. Sorry, I went a little bit fast at the end there, but hopefully that'll give you a flavor of what we're doing.